The morning of June 15th, 1944, Philippine Sea, 150 miles west of Saipan. Lieutenant Saburō Aramaki squinted through the wind-blown salt haze from the cockpit of his A6M5 Zero, the early light glinting off the green sea far below. His flight of 9 aircraft from the 601st Naval Air Group had been searching for the American invasion fleet for nearly 2 hours. Their radio direction finders, primitive and unreliable, had picked up scattered bearings from the east, but no one expected what appeared next. Just after 8:30, Aramaki's wingman shouted into the intercom, "Ships, many ships!" And through the distant haze, the ocean seemed to sparkle with hundreds of white wakes. A vast armada stretched beyond the horizon, dozens of carriers, cruisers, destroyers, transports. It was unlike anything the Japanese airmen had ever seen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But it was not the fleet itself that puzzled them most, it was the ships leading the northern screen. Low, box-like silhouettes, half the length of a proper carrier, with flat decks that seemed absurdly small for aircraft operations. Aramaki laughed into his mask. Toy carriers, he called them. Training ships, perhaps. His intelligence briefings from Truk and Tinian had mentioned that the Americans used such vessels to ferry aircraft and supplies, not to fight. They could not imagine them launching combat sorties in the middle of a major sea battle. Yet in the next 48 hours, those same toy carriers would help unleash one of the most devastating aerial onslaughts in the history of naval warfare, hundreds of aircraft striking from ships no larger than a cruiser. By the end of June 19th, Japanese naval aviation, the force that had once terrorized the Pacific, would be effectively destroyed. The irony was brutal. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the Pacific War, believing that carrier warfare was a domain for specialists, elite aviators trained from adolescence, flying from magnificent fleet carriers like Akagi, Kaga, and Shokaku. Anything less than those giants, they believed, was a waste of metal. Escort carriers, slow, ungainly, built on merchant hulls, were an affront to everything the Japanese Navy considered sacred about aviation. To understand why the sight of these tiny American ships provoked laughter rather than fear, one must return to the mindset of 1941, when the rising sun ruled the Western Pacific. For the Japanese, air power was artistry. Pilots were warriors, craftsmen of death, trained through years of ritualistic discipline. Their machines, the Zero, the Val, the Kate, were instruments of precision, designed for agility and range rather than durability. Naval aviation was not a mass enterprise, it was an elite order, and its carriers were floating temples to the craft. By contrast, American naval aviation had begun the war as a logistical problem. In 1942, the U.S. Navy possessed only 7 fleet carriers. By any strategic measure, it was insufficient to fight across an ocean 6,000 miles wide. But American planners, men like Admiral Ernest King and shipbuilder Henry Kaiser, approached the issue with industrial pragmatism. If they could not build large carriers fast enough, they would build small ones in great numbers. These vessels, officially designated CVE carrier, vessel, escort, were constructed on the hulls of merchant ships, oilers, and tankers. They could be built in 4 months instead of 4 years. Their top speed rarely exceeded 19 knots. Their decks were short, their elevators crude, and their hangars cramped. Yet they carried the same essential tools of naval power: aircraft. To Japanese strategists, this was absurd. Carriers were meant to be fast enough to maneuver with the fleet, armored enough to resist near misses, and staffed by veteran aviators. Escort carriers, by every Japanese metric, violated the principles of naval warfare. The Imperial Navy's Intelligence Division estimated that such ships could perhaps ferry aircraft to island bases or provide minor anti-submarine patrols. In their classification charts, the Americans' Bogue-class and Casablanca-class carriers were marked as auxiliaries, not as legitimate combatants. That assumption held through the early years of the war. At Coral Sea, Midway, and Santa Cruz, only the big fleet carriers had mattered. But while Japan's proud carriers were being sunk faster than they could be replaced, America's shipyards were producing something astonishing: 50 Casablanca-class escort carriers in just 1 year. Each one carried about 28 aircraft and a crew of 900 men. By late 1943, the Americans began experimenting with them in active operations, first for convoy protection in the Atlantic, then for amphibious assaults in the Pacific. It was here that a quiet revolution took shape, one unnoticed by Japanese reconnaissance. The U.S. Navy began pairing these small carriers with destroyer escorts and oilers, forming self-contained escort carrier groups. They could patrol independently, far from the main battle fleet, hunting submarines, supporting landings, or providing constant air cover. Each ship launched dozens of sorties daily, their maintenance crews working in rotating shifts around the clock. The Japanese believed such sustained tempo was impossible. Their own carriers, with the best-trained deck crews in the world, could manage perhaps 1 or 2 strikes a day before exhaustion and fuel limitations set in. The notion that a slow auxiliary could launch and recover hundreds of aircraft across a single day defied everything they knew about naval aviation logistics. What they did not realize was that the Americans had reorganized warfare itself. Instead of relying on individual pilot genius, the U.S. Navy relied on procedure, teamwork, and redundancy. Every man on a Casablanca class had a manual, a checklist, a timetable. Aircraft were serviced in parallel rather than sequentially. Ordnance crews used standardized mounts. Fuel lines were color-coded and quick disconnect. Deck directors operated with colored paddles that mirrored the Army Air Force's traffic signals. Efficiency replaced artistry. By the time of the Mariana Islands campaign in June 1944, the Americans had refined the system to an industrial rhythm. The escort carriers of Task Group 52.14, 12 ships in all, could launch up to 400 sorties a day in support of the Saipan invasion. Wildcats, Avengers, and Helldivers operated in constant rotation, striking Japanese positions, covering landing craft, and maintaining air patrols over the fleet. To men like Lieutenant Aramaki, circling above the Philippine Sea, this was inconceivable. In Japanese doctrine, only the main fleet carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, possessed the capability to coordinate massed airstrikes. Their crews numbered over 2,000. Their hangars were masterpieces of organization. Yet by mid-June 1944, 2 of those great ships would be at the bottom of the sea, victims of American submarines and fuel vapor explosions. The American escort carriers, meanwhile, kept flying. In the eyes of Japanese intelligence, this created a paradox. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the infamous Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japanese pilots reported facing hundreds of enemy fighters long after they believed the American fleet's main carriers should have exhausted their air groups. They concluded that the Americans had brought more fleet carriers than reconnaissance had detected. The truth was stranger. Half of the aircraft they encountered had launched from Jeep carriers, as the Americans called them. These tiny ships, dismissed as auxiliaries, had become force multipliers of staggering effect. Behind this transformation lay not a single technological miracle, but a cultural one. In the Imperial Japanese Navy, the pilot was everything. Training a naval aviator required 5 to 7 years. Out of every 100 cadets, barely a dozen graduated. Their skill was extraordinary, but their numbers were finite. Each loss was irreplaceable. The Americans approached the problem with arithmetic. They built flight schools across the continent, Corpus Christi, Pensacola, Great Lakes, turning out thousands of pilots every few months. Many were assigned to escort carriers as their first operational experience. The ships became floating classrooms as much as combat platforms. By the summer of 1944, nearly half of all U.S. Navy aviators had trained or served on escort carriers. The Japanese saw these pilots as inexperienced amateurs. Yet the Americans viewed it differently. A pilot who survived his first few weeks aboard a Casablanca-class carrier had learned deck discipline, navigation, and strike coordination under the most demanding conditions imaginable. In retrospect, the Japanese had mistaken quantity for weakness. Lieutenant Aramaki's flight finally closed within 60 miles of the enemy formation. Radar pips guided American fighters upward Grumman F-6F Hellcats from the USS White Plains and Fanshawe Bay. The intercept unfolded with mechanical precision. Each division of Wildcats peeled off in pairs, climbing through the sun, diving in coordinated bursts. Within minutes, 3 Japanese Zeros were spiraling into the sea. Aramaki escaped only by diving into a cloud bank. When he returned to base at Guam, his aircraft carried more bullet holes than fuel. His squadron leader, Lieutenant Commander Nishizawa, examined the damage silently. Then, shaking his head, he muttered, "These Americans they fight from, everywhere now." That night, as he wrote his combat report by the dim light of a kerosene lamp, Aramaki added one final line beneath the standard headings of enemy strength and ammunition expended. He wrote simply, "Their carriers are too many and too small to count." He did not know it, but his words echoed what Japanese staff officers in Tokyo were already beginning to realize: the enemy's strength was not measured in tonnage or ship class, but in output. The Americans had found a way to make even small ships vast. Dawn, October 25, 1944, off Samar Island in the central Philippines. The sea lay calm beneath a pale sky streaked with the last remnants of night. Lieutenant Commander Sadamu Takahashi, of the Imperial Japanese Navy's 601st Air Group, stood on the catwalk of the carrier Zuikaku, one of the last survivors of the great carrier fleet that had once ruled the Pacific. He was 29 years old, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, and he could feel in the deck's vibrations that his ship was already doomed. The radio chatter from the previous evening told him what Tokyo had not dared to announce aloud. Admiral Ozawa's northern force was a decoy, sailing north to lure the Americans away from Leyte Gulf. The real striking force, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, had slipped through San Bernardino Strait to attack the landing forces directly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To Takahashi and his fellow airmen, the plan seemed desperate but honorable. The great Yamato and Nagato would crush the American transports. The decoy carriers would die gloriously. It was a plan worthy of Bushido. What none of them yet realized was that Kurita's assault, when it came, would collide not with the powerful American Third Fleet, but with something that defied every coot. Japanese expectation. Task Unit 7, 7.4.3, known simply as Taffy 3, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts, a mere screen for troop convoys. According to every calculation in the Imperial Navy's doctrine, such a force should have been annihilated within minutes by Kurita's 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers. The Yamato alone displaced 70,000 tons, each of its 9 18-inch guns capable of hurling a shell the weight of a small car 20 miles. Against that stood ships half her length, with wooden decks and armor scarcely thicker than a finger's breadth. At 8 in the morning local time, the Japanese gunners opened fire. Shells weighing nearly 2 tons apiece rose in slow arcs and crashed down among the tiny American ships. The first salvos straddled the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay, hurling geysers higher than her mast. To the Japanese spotters, it looked like certain victory. But the ocean that morning belonged not to mathematics, but to audacity. Captain Thomas Sprague, commanding Taffy 3 from the Fanshawe Bay, gave a single order: "Launch everything we've got." Every American deck crew moved as if by instinct. Wildcats and Avengers were rolled onto the decks, armed or not, fueled or half-fueled. Within 10 minutes, the escort carriers had launched their entire air group's 165 aircraft. To Japanese observers, watching from the bridges of Yamato and Kongo, the sight was incomprehensible. These slow merchant-hulled carriers, already under fire, were still launching planes at a rate no fleet carrier in their navy could match. Takahashi's after-action report, recovered after the war, records his disbelief. The enemy carriers continued to send aircraft, even while shells fell among them. Their deck operations were executed with machine precision. We believed they had no pilots left, yet still they launched. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense, but a sustained act of defiance that rewrote the psychology of sea warfare. The American destroyers, Johnston, Hole, and Heermann charged headlong at the Japanese fleet, laying smoke screens and firing torpedoes at point-blank range. The escort carriers, too slow to flee, turned into the wind and recovered returning aircraft, while others circled overhead, attacking with bombs, rockets, and even machine gun strafes when their ammunition ran dry. From his observation post aboard Yamato, Commander Hashimoto later wrote in his diary, "The enemy's behavior was beyond comprehension. They were like bees defending a hive, small and furious, unafraid of death." Within 40 minutes, Japanese fire control began to break down. The smoke, rain squalls, and constant harassment from the American aircraft shattered coordination. Chokai, a heavy cruiser, took a direct hit from a 500-pound bomb dropped by a Taffy 3 Avenger and exploded amidships. Kumano was torpedoed and fell out of line. Suzuya detonated when near misses set off her own torpedoes. From the air, the scene resembled chaos. In truth, it was organized mayhem, orchestrated by crews trained to operate under relentless tempo. Each escort carrier cycled aircraft through a continuous loop: launch, strike, land, refuel, relaunch, often with less than 15 minutes between operations. The Japanese, whose carriers had always required hours to prepare a coordinated strike, could not fathom how such tempo was even possible. The secret lay in the mundane arithmetic of American logistics. Every Casablanca-class carrier carried spare parts, folding wing mechanisms, and prefabricated maintenance kits standardized across the fleet. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics had issued manuals describing in exact sequence how to launch 24 aircraft in 12 minutes, and every ship practiced the routine until it became reflex. It was this procedural discipline, what American officers called deck cycle doctrine, that allowed the escort carriers to sustain nearly 400 sorties per day during the Leyte campaign. For the Japanese, whose culture of craftsmanship prized individual perfection over systemic efficiency, this was a revelation too late to matter. By 10:30 that morning, Kurita's force began to withdraw. The admiral later told his staff that he believed he was fighting the entire American Third Fleet. In reality, he had been driven off by a handful of jeep carriers and their escorts. When the order to disengage reached Zuikaku, Lieutenant Commander Takahashi was already preparing his final strike. The carrier's deck was afire. Smoke drifted through the flight control tower. "If we must die," he told his crew, "we will die striking." He led 12 planes toward the distant horizon where the enemy was reported, but when they arrived, there was nothing left to strike. Kurita had vanished into the rain squalls, leaving behind a sea littered with wreckage and burning oil. That night, aboard the Zuikaku, the last operational veteran of Pearl Harbor, Takahashi and his men knelt on the flight deck as the ship's loudspeakers played the national anthem. Below them, engineers opened the seacocks. The carrier rolled slowly onto her side and slipped beneath the waves. For the surviving Japanese pilots rescued from the water, the aftermath was more haunting than death. They had witnessed the impossible. Small carriers surviving under the guns of battleships, launching aircraft even as shells exploded among them. At their debriefings on Formosa weeks later, naval intelligence officers struggled to reconcile reports from Leyte and Samar. "It is inconceivable," read one memorandum, "that auxiliary carriers could operate with such persistence. The Americans appear to possess an inexhaustible number of planes." The truth, compiled after the war, was staggering. Between June and October 1944, the escort carriers of the U.S. Pacific Fleet flew more than 60,000 sorties, averaging nearly 400 per day during major operations. They sank or damaged over 100 Japanese vessels and provided continuous air cover for every amphibious landing from Saipan to Luzon. Their cost in material terms was trivial. Each Casablanca-class carrier required fewer than 900 men to operate and consumed half the fuel of a fleet carrier. But their psychological cost to Japan was incalculable. Every Japanese aviator who survived the Marianas and Leyte understood that the age of the warrior pilot had ended. The enemy no longer relied on heroism, he relied on process. Lieutenant Aramaki, the same pilot who had first mocked the toy carriers months earlier, survived the war as a prisoner on Guam. When interviewed by American naval historians in 1947, he spoke with quiet awe. "We believed the Americans could not fight without their great carriers. Then we saw them fight with small ones, and we understood that we had already lost. Their strength was not in a few big ships, but in 1,000 small ones that never stopped working." In the end, the Japanese Navy's greatest illusion was not about technology or courage. It was about scale. They had sought perfection in every pilot and every machine, while their enemy sought sufficiency multiplied 1,000-fold. The escort carriers embodied that philosophy, imperfect individually, invincible collectively. When the war ended in August 1945, many of those tiny ships were scrapped or sold, their decks silent once more. Yet in their brief existence, they had changed naval warfare more profoundly than any battleship or fleet carrier ever had. They proved that in the modern world, power did not reside in grandeur but in repetition, the relentless rhythm of machines, men, and procedures working together across the boundless sea. In the first months after surrender, when Japan lay silent under occupation, the surviving officers of the Imperial Navy were summoned to testify before the Allied technical missions. They arrived in threadbare uniforms, their swords confiscated, their pride intact but hollow. Among them sat Lieutenant Commander Sadamu Takahashi and Lieutenant Saburō Aramaki, both former carrier aviators. The Americans questioned them not about tactics or courage, but about belief, why the Japanese Navy had never developed an equivalent to the escort carrier. Takahashi's answer, recorded by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey in early 1946, was painfully candid. "We believed a carrier must be a flagship, a thing of beauty and speed. We thought small ships were for merchants, not warriors. We mistook elegance for strength." That confession captured the essence of Japan's pre-war naval ideology. For 2 decades, Japanese admirals had pursued perfection in limited numbers, magnificent ships, exquisite aircraft, and irreplaceable pilots. The Americans, by contrast, had treated war as an engineering problem. If one carrier could not be made large enough, they would build 50 small ones. If one pilot could not be trained for 10 years, they would train 1,000 in one. This divergence became the defining legacy of the escort carrier. It demonstrated that industrial democracy, impersonal, procedural, and redundant, could outperform warrior aristocracy in the age of machines. When U.S. occupation officers toured Japanese shipyards in 1946, they found half-built escort carriers on the drawing boards of Mitsubishi and Kawasaki projects abandoned when Japan's economy collapsed. The engineers admitted that, even had they been completed, Japan lacked the steel, fuel, and pilots to operate them. The idea had come too late. Across the Pacific, the legacy of the Casablanca class lived on. During the late 1940s and early 50s, many of the surviving hulls were recommissioned as anti-submarine carriers. They hunted Soviet submarines across the North Atlantic and trained generations of NATO aviators. Their small decks and modular designs inspired the post-war Commencement Bay and Essex conversions that would carry jet aircraft into the Korean War. But their greatest influence was psychological. The escort carriers had proven that naval aviation was no longer the province of the elite few. It could be industrialized, scaled, and democratized. The myth of the heroic lone pilot, the samurai in the sky, gave way to the age of systems. For the Japanese aviators who survived, this was a truth more difficult than defeat. In the ruins of Yokosuka, the once mighty Naval Academy reopened in 1952 as part of the newly formed Maritime Self-Defense Force. Among its first instructors was Saburō Aramaki. His lectures to young cadets were quiet and unsentimental. "Technology without humility," he told them, "is suicide. But humility without technology is slavery. We must learn both." He often showed his students a faded photograph, tiny carriers steaming in column through the Philippine Sea, their decks crowded with aircraft, their wakes white against the blue. "These were the ships we laughed at," he would say. "They were the future, and we could not see it." In Washington, naval planners reached the same conclusion from the opposite direction. The escort carriers had been a stopgap born of necessity, yet they revealed something profound about American power. They proved that flexibility and numbers could achieve what grandeur could not. When Admiral Raymond Spruance wrote his post-war analysis for the Naval War College, he put it plainly. Victory at sea was secured not by the largest ships, but by the smallest that could fight all day, every day. By 1950, the United States began converting several escort carriers into helicopter platforms prototypes for the amphibious assault ships that would later carry Marines to Korea, Vietnam, beyond. The philosophy was the same: small decks, continuous operations, overwhelming tempo. The lineage of the Casablanca class extended quietly into the nuclear age. Japan, meanwhile, turned inward. Its new constitution renounced war, yet the memory of Leyte and the Marianas lingered in every naval memoir. When Japanese engineers studied American carrier design during the security cooperation programs of the 1960s, they recognized familiar silhouettes. The new helicopter destroyers, such as Haruna and Hiei, were in many respects spiritual descendants of the escort carriers they had once dismissed. Takahashi, who had survived years of internment, attended the commissioning of the Haruna in 1973 as an honored guest. Standing on the deck, he reportedly murmured to a reporter, "We have built the toy again, but this time, it is ours." By then, nearly all of the original Casablanca-class carriers had been scrapped. A few lingered as training ships, others as depots. Only one, the USS Bogue, survived into the mid-60s before being broken for metal, yet their influence could be traced through every modern carrier doctrine: constant air patrols, modular logistics, rapid sortie cycles. In the collective memory of the Pacific War, the escort carriers seldom claimed glory. They lacked the grandeur of Enterprise or Yorktown, the drama of Midway, or the mythic aura of Yamato, yet they accomplished something far greater than symbolic victory. They dissolved the last illusions of technological aristocracy. They proved that mastery lay not in perfection, but in persistence. For historians, the irony remains exquisite. The Imperial Navy had begun the war by demonstrating the power of carrier aviation at Pearl Harbor, a single, perfectly coordinated strike that stunned the world. It ended the war defeated by an enemy who no longer needed perfection, only repetition. On the morning of September 2nd, 1945, as the Japanese delegation signed the instrument of surrender aboard the USS Missouri, dozens of escort carriers lay anchored around Tokyo Bay. Their decks were lined with aircraft whose engines still clicked from cooling metal. No one announced their presence. They were too common to notice. Yet it was their endless, monotonous work, sortie after sortie, launch after launch, that had made that morning possible. Decades later, when a new generation of historians examined the war's logistics, one statistic stood out. Between 1943 and 1945, the U.S. Navy launched more combat sorties from escort carriers than from all fleet carriers combined. The ships, once dismissed as auxiliaries, had become the beating heart of American naval power. And in that fact lies the ultimate reversal, the one the Japanese pilots never expected. The tiny escort carriers, born of improvisation and mocked as toys, had transformed the very definition of naval might. They taught the world that in the age of industry, victory did not belong to the few who flew best, but to the many who kept flying. The war had begun with laughter at their small decks. It ended with silence broken only by the sound of their aircraft engines, starting again, ready for another launch. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.